African constitutional democracy seemed to be under threat by the violent elections from the opposition and violent reaction by government and also by court challenges after the announcement of results. Zimbabwe is currently experiencing this and Mali is going through the same. Is this going to define African constitutional democracy? And now joining us in studio, we have Professor Shadrach Gutto at the African Renaissance Institution in UNISA. A very warm welcome to you, sir, and thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, and good evening or good night to the viewers here.
And now, Prof, how is Africa doing when we look at constitutional democracy?
It is a challenge. We do have a situation where we have different types of constitutions. The newer constitutions, which are better written and made by the people participating, and the old constitutions, some of them were inherited in negotiations with the former colonial masters. So there are different types of constitutions that are there. But be that as it may, I always indicate and believe that it is not just the Constitution, the letter of the paper on which the Constitution is written. It is, do we translate whatever Constitution we have into constitutionalism, which means that it is made alive, it is made part of the culture of the society, and not just something which is on paper. So that means you use the Constitution, but you create constitutionalism, which is putting life into the Constitution through practice, through various challenges, through popularization of the Constitution, and so on. So Africa is not one country. We have 55 states on the continent. And therefore, when we are talking about Africa and the constitutions, we have to be aware that there are different practices on the continent. Some countries are doing very well. They have given life to the constitution, as we very well saw today in the ruling in the Constitutional Court. That is giving life to the Constitution, not simply saying that we have provisions within it which gives the president this kind of power. But is that power constitutional or not? And I think those are the most important and difficult matters to be dealt with.
And when you talk about giving life to the Constitution, what exactly do you mean?
What that means is that, first of all, the Constitution needs to be understood by the people. And we need to ensure that our constitutions are translated into all the national languages and made available so that people are able to read and understand them. That's not the case. And I think that that is important. I was in Zimbabwe about a month ago and so on. And they're trying to translate the Zimbabwe Constitution into 15 languages which are in Zimbabwe. People don't know that. They just think Zimbabwe is made up of the Shonas and the Ndebeles. They didn't know that the Sotho, the Tsonga, the Swana, and are all part of even the language of the Khoisan and so on. It's one of the languages there, but we don't know that.
Yeah, true.
And that's part of the problem, that we have constitutions which are not understood by the people. And people are not urged to understand it better, so that when the leadership or whatever institution ought to implement certain aspect, people demand that they do so. And they do so through going through the right channels, like the courts of law and so on. But you also need within the country independent and judiciary, where you have competent judicial officers, whether it is at the magistrates level, whether it's at the high court level, whether it is the Court of Appeal or Constitutional Court. And I think that those are the kind of challenges that I'm talking about. And if you want to challenge anything, including elections, you use the Constitution as a basis on which to do it. But then there are other laws also. And there are values in society and practices in society. And all of those become very, very important in giving life to the Constitution.
And you're also saying that the Constitution needs to be understood by the people of that specific country. Now, how can it be made possible that everyone gets the most adequate amount of education on constitutional democracy, especially of a specific country? You mentioned that Zimbabwe is changing the constitution, allowing that 15 languages will be also put into the constitution. Now, looking at that, how can we make sure that everyone gets adequate amount of education?
They want to translate the Constitution, not that those languages should, but they ought to be recognized as such. In South Africa, we talk about South Africa as 11 languages. Yeah. That's not true. We have a lot of languages, over 20 languages in the country. But people don't know that. They just go because it is written that there are 11. The people assume that there are 11. So I think that it is very important for us to be able to scrutinize the Constitution to ensure that it is interpreted in a manner that is progressive and purposive. In other words, to realize the purpose for which those provisions are in the Constitution. As I have already mentioned, we have had a lot of cases in the courts. Some of them succeed, some don't. But it is important that people have confidence in the judiciary. It is important that Parliament does its work to hold the executive accountable. If that doesn't happen, then provisions in the Constitution that talk like the South African one, that we are going to have really a transparent and responsible governance and so on, that those who perform constitutional provisions, that is Section 237, ought to do so diligently and without delay. And I think that is important, because sometimes we have people with responsibilities, but they don't carry out their work diligently and without delay. They always delay and so on. So the life in our Constitution ought to be improved, and people need to know it. And I think that the school system, not just at the university level where we teach law and so on, but it should be something which should be made compulsory at even primary school, at secondary school, at high school, and in a simplified form, but properly explained. But the teachers themselves ought to go through training so that they know how to be able to teach it. If they don't know, then it is useless to put it in the syllabus or of the schools and so on, because those are where we need to start. And we also need to do so at village levels, community levels, community halls, with traditional leaders also need to go through it so that they understand that they are not above the Constitution. Political parties ought to know the Constitution, and we don't train them enough to be able to understand them. And that's why politicians make a lot of mistakes. Political parties make a lot of mistakes and so on. I'm not saying that if it is well known, there are no people who will violate them. We are in a society, and therefore you need to deal with constitutionalism, constitutional values and proper interpretation and implementation.
And now, looking at Zimbabwe and Mali currently, they went to the polls recently. Elections took place, and they were accompanied by violence. And we also know that court actions are also taking place currently in Zimbabwe. Has this become a common trend in Africa? And what should we expect next from other countries?
Well, if we just take those two countries, I think Mali won. We still, they say that Keita may win the elections. In Zimbabwe, the Electoral Commission, Management Commission, announced the victory of Emerson Mnangagwa as president of the country. The constituency results were not the challenge. It was a question of between the two candidates, the MDC coalition. It is not just the MDC as the old one, it is a coalition of many parties. But they started announcing, the opposition parties started announcing elections that Chamisa had won, even before the Independent Electoral Commission had done so. That is unconstitutional. And it is one that damages the image of the Constitution, because you are taking the responsibility of a body which is established by the Constitution, and you are claiming victory. It is not for political parties to announce the results of elections. So we need to deal with those. But of course, there's a challenge in Zimbabwe of the results of presidential elections, which I think papers are being filed and it will go to court. And one hopes that it does so sooner than later, because by yesterday, the president, Emerson Mnangagwa, should have been inaugurated and sworn in. That did not take place. So, but then also the violence that arose in the Zimbabwean question, because there are people who are saying they know that the MDC coalition presidential candidate had already won. Then they take to the streets and they start violence. Constitutions do not allow that. And even in South Africa, we have a lot of very violent society where when people demonstrate or they assemble, they destroy things. Even in schools, they destroy a laboratory, they destroy and burn them, and so on. Now, that is not really, the Constitution prohibits destruction of property, violence against other people, and so on and so forth. So these are the things that I'm saying are critical to be able to be done. But of course, we had a situation in Zimbabwe where one of the leaders of the opposition, who used to be Minister of Finance in the old coalition government, and IBC, was going into seek asylum or refugee status in Zambia. We don't know what's going to happen in a court of law. Evidence must be brought and tested in the courts. And that is part of the imperatives of the Constitution. It is not just reading it, but also proper interpretation of it. So we wait to see what will happen. But then there have been many countries where there have been violence during elections, or rather before elections, during elections, after elections, despite the fact that we have the African Charter on democracy, elections, and governance. And many countries don't even know the existence of that and have not incorporated or improved their constitutions to follow those in terms of elections and so on, and the role also of ensuring that there's gender enhancement within elections and so forth. Those are not properly done. So we need to deal with all of that. But then we also have human rights, fundamental and people's rights in most constitutions.
And talking about rights, I want to go back to Tendai Biti, who attempted to cross into Zambia for political asylum. At this point, what constitutional rights does he have?
Well, he was taken to the magistrate's court. He has to defend himself and be able to say why was he thinking that his life was in danger and therefore to leave the country. And indeed, going to a neighboring country, as he tried to Zambia, is risky because neighboring countries do not want to harbor people who are fugitives who run from justice in their own countries. I don't know why Tendai Biti, who is a lawyer, a very good lawyer indeed, did not take the matter to court or seek protection by going to court to say he thinks that his life is in danger. Instead, he decided to, go into seek exile.
Now, most people have said that going to court in Zimbabwe, it seems as if it's captured by the ZANU-PF party, meaning that whatever matter they have, they will never favor the victims.
Yeah, that's why I've already indicated that you need a judiciary which is strong and a judiciary which is respected by political parties, by leaders, including the president. Today, we saw in the Constitutional Court ruling that was dealing with Abraham Sean's case and so on, where the Constitutional Court, the majority were quite clear that President Jacob Zuma removed the former National Prosecuting Authority, the National Director of Prosecuting Authorities, and appointed Abraham Sean and so on. And that was unconstitutional and wrong. And therefore, it was not just Abraham in court. President Jacob Zuma was also being tried or was being questioned by the court in his absence. And the judgment is very clear that he made a wrong decision of appointing Abraham Sean as the National Director of Public Prosecution. But even the one who was there before, whom President Jacob Zuma had removed, was found to have done or arranged with President Jacob Zuma to be paid off so that room could be created for Abraham Sean and so on. And that they're being asked, or the court ruled that he pays back 10 million out of the money which he was given so that he can stand aside. That's what we mean by giving life to the Constitution, and the judiciary is very important in that regard. Yeah.
Okay. And what scenarios could we see play out now that the opposition in Zimbabwe has filed papers at the Constitutional Court?
I think it is good that they have finally done that, and one hopes to see what ZANU-PF will do, or Emerson Mnangagwa will do, so that the matter is heard in court. And mind you, in court, it is critical examination of the evidence which is there. And since this is not a criminal matter, it is where you have to prove things beyond reasonable doubt. It is one where you have to prove them on balance of probabilities. And both sides will have to provide evidence and to make arguments in court, which people will examine. So I think that this is very, very important, that the matters are in court rather than being decided on streets with destruction of property, violence against each other, burning of cars and vehicles and so on. And, by doing that, you are really not helping because there's protection of the right to property. There's provisions within constitutions which say violence against people is wrong, criminal, and constitutional. All those will be evidence that will be brought to court and tested. We don't know what the court will decide in that regard. But we have many countries where violence has occurred. It is not just in Zimbabwe. And some or most of them nowadays go to court rather than continue forever, because otherwise people do not have peace and security and cannot be able to make a living because they fear and they don't really do the work to be able to generate the economy and so on. You cannot develop an economy in a situation of insecurity. There's no way in which that can happen. So it means stagnation in our countries and lack of development.
And what do you make of the constitutional foundation on which political rights are exercised and how the electoral process has been used in most of these African countries so far?
If you look at it, we do have, and I'll give an example of South Africa at this particular point. You do have provisions in the Constitution which clearly indicate that we are going to have free and regular elections, and that under a common voters' roll, and we are going to have that, and then we will, obviously, citizens do have the right to form political parties. That is also written in the Constitution, and to participate in elections. And then you have legislation or laws that deal with elections. So those are important because they govern how elections are to be made. So management of democratic elections in Africa become very, very important. And indeed, at UNISA, we have a program that deals with trying to strengthen independent electoral management bodies so that they are able to conduct credible and elections that people can trust and believe in, whoever wins and loses. When you go to elections, you don't go there that everybody is going to win, every party is going to win. That's part of the problem that we are dealing with, that everybody thinks that they're going to win. Everybody wants to be president of a country. You can only have one. And therefore, managing proper elections which are credible, which are believable, which can be tested in a court of law. If you claim that maybe the voters' roll was wrong, then you go to court and you indicate how, and you give evidence, and the court will examine that and agree with it. So I think that it is very, very important for us to really stop taking, as they say, the law into our own hands, because we are citizens. Therefore, we take the law into our own hands. So sometimes, you go to court and you lose, and you have to, the principle of the rule of law requires that we accept the decision that has been made by the courts, that we are able to apply the rule of law in everything that we do.
And talking about the rule of law, that if you go to court, you're going to win or lose, I want us to look at the process of holding a corrupt government to account. Looking at African countries giving immunity against facing justice to government officials.
I think that you are right, that on the continent, and I don't want to say that it is only in Africa. We are dealing with a global problem here. It is not just in Africa. We have in countries like the US now a president who is a racist, who is a sexist, who is, promoting racism, promoting sexism in the country, where the Constitution of the US is regarded to be one of the old ones, where there have been good practices and so on. So it depends on who is in leadership. And the Constitution needs to provide for recall of a leader if at all they are seen not to be abiding by the Constitution. Do you have provisions in the Constitution which allow people to go for referendum or plebiscite to remove whoever was elected? Without such threats to the leaders, they think they own the country. And we do have corruption is rampant in many African countries, but not only in African countries, elsewhere, also in other parts of the world. And corruption is stealing people's money.
That is very true, Professor, but unfortunately I have run out of time. But thank you so much for coming into studio and having this discussion with me.
You are welcome.
Thank you, Professor. That was Professor Shadrach Gutto from the African Renaissance Institute in UNISA, just giving us more details on the African constitutional democracy, which seems to be under threat by the violent elections from the opposition and violent reaction by government, and also by court challenges after the announcement of results. And we've seen this across the African continent. And right now, that's all we have time for here on Africa Tonight. Good night.